I call Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First to make comment on this third reading and also to speak on behalf of my colleague Clayton Mitchell, who is unable to present here today. I want to start, Mr Speaker, by saying that at the outset on the first reading, my colleague Clayton Mitchell made it clear that New Zealand First would support the legislation for its first reading in the hope that we would see some reforms that we could live with and we thought and had confidence in, and that would make the fire service truly more efficient across the board and hopefully less costly, and hopefully that any reforms would not unduly hit people unfairly with levies, whilst at the same time allowing others to sit on the sidelines and contribute nothing. We were not, I have to say also, Mr Speaker, right from the outset, I'm one of those gentlemen, I'm a father-in-law of a man that I'm very, very proud of, by the name of Scott Shadbolt, who is the highest decorated firefighter in New Zealand. He's the recipient of the Valour Award, first to receive it in 106 years, one of only 3 people to have been awarded it. Through him and other members of my family who are professional firefighters and volunteer firefighters, I'm fortunate that I have a pretty good understanding of some of the issues within the fire service, and so too does Clayton Mitchell. I'm also privileged as a former mayor to have some very good friends in the Carterton Volunteer Fire Service who did our district and our people proud during the awful balloon tragedy that happened in the rohe of Hurunuirangi, which resulted in the deaths of 11 people. I can say to this House that on a day-to-day basis I see these firefighters, and I can assure you that those firefighters still have some pretty vivid and horrific memories burned into their brain as a result of that work, the unfortunate work that they were required to do in the service of our community. I'm immensely proud of them and will always be so grateful to them. New Zealand First is not blind and has never been blind to some of the issues that have plagued our fire service internally. We all know well that the difference between professional firefighters and volunteer firefighters, and just like in the army you had the same issue between regular soldiers and territorial force soldiers, some called some trogs and other names, and that's just the way the culture had evolved over the years. And we know that there are clear differences, professional differences. We know there are some skill sets differences between rural firefighters and urban firefighters. We know that there are differentials in competencies. And the issues around command have long been known, where some commanders have been surroundingly, scathingly attacked by professional and volunteer firefighters alike. We're not blind to the issues and the challenges, and we supported the first reading in the hope that we might be able to address some of these things and support it. So, come to the second reading. Again, Clayton Mitchell pointed out his concerns about the levy, the weight of this falling mainly on commercial building owners and residential people through their insurance. He had already raised in the first reading questions around why could we not look at compulsory third-party insurance for motor vehicles and tap a levy in there. We would also solve another problem out there, and which is related to vehicle accidents. That clearly was not something that the committee or the minister wanted to accept. I think we raised the issue, concerns about the many people who would be paying, business people in particular, residence owners in particular, and the number of people who would remain untouched outside of the levy regime. Committee stage, you know, I'm reading from his Hansard, 96% of the submissions opposed the levy proposal, not a levy at all, but this levy proposal and the way it was purported that it would work, and their belief of how it was actually going to work in the end of the day. The issue around the fire service being made to responsible for and required to divert resources of its own in order to now become a collection agency, and questions were raised by Mr Mitchell Isn't that what IRD does? And isn't that a more appropriate way to do that? I'm not unsure myself, having not sat on the committee, as to why the committee followed this path and why all the other parties agree to it. Mr Mitchell and New Zealand First do not. Uncapped levies is another issue, and I want to raise, there have been concerns raised out there. Mr Dunn might consider these to be interest groups who are only focused on self-interest. But I read a media release and a comment that said New Zealanders will have to pay an extra 40% in their insurance fire levy from July, despite the assertions that this amalgamation of fire services is about efficiency. This government's reform package will result in an immediate cost increase of $80 million for little or no increase in services, despite the claims by the Minister that these reforms will save money. The predictions from the Taxpayers Union is that total fire service costs will shoot up $80 million per year, despite efficiency being the key promise by Mr Dunn of these reforms. What is worth, the government has increased the economic burden on New Zealanders without any comparable increase in the level of service. Now, we in New Zealand First can't help but reflect for a little moment on this government. This government won those government benches and 59-odd MPs on a campaign, and I'm hoping Labor's listening, on a campaign that they would reduce compliance costs to business, that they would be business-friendly, that they were the business people's best buddies. And yet, when we look at this legislation on the backdrop of other government legislation, what do we see? Well, we see an earthquake-prone buildings piece of legislation being rammed through the House that is foisting upon business people massive increases in costs for no increased capability in their buildings at all, despite the fact that these buildings are little wooden buildings tucked away in villages around the country, which have withstood every major earthquake thus far, including the last one. And is there going to be no gain for them at all? Increase in business costs. Look at the occupational safety and health legislation that this government's rammed through, which has been highly criticised out there now and is foisting upon people massive compliance costs that will give no productivity gain at all, and much of it is much of what they're required to do is just plain common sense anyway. You look at the government's refusal to allow New Zealand First to get legislation through that would change the cost of strengthening these buildings from capital works to repairs and maintenance, and allow them to get a tax break. Well, this government prevented that. 4 areas now, with this bill going through, 4 areas alone where this government, purporting itself to be business-friendly, is foisting upon commercial operators, commercial building owners, even residents who rent properties, massive compliance costs. Now, there's no word for that. And we can't use it in this House, but it rings in the ears. And it simply says that if you truly believe that when people voted this government in, they're going to get a reduction in compliance costs in the business sector, forget it. There's 4 big whammies that you've just got. This piece of legislation, well, I can see the nodding and shaking heads of Mr Hudson over there, so I'll read something out from a piece by McKenna. They hate business, don't they? McKenna. Using the government's own figures, the total cost of this new entity, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, will shoot up $80 million each year. The burden of these costs will fall on only those who insure for property, not on all those people out there who do not insure. The changes in 1 July will see a 40% increase in fire levies on insurance policies for residential insurance holders. The fire levy applies only to the first $100,000 of cover, so the increase will be a maximum of $36.20 per annum. However, because the cap does not apply to non-residential property, the average levy paid will be substantially higher. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First would have liked to have supported this bill, but the signals that we gave right at the start have been ignored, and the government has gone ahead anyway. Reform is needed, and we applauded that thought, but this is not the way. to have done it.
Pauline McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.